Olá, seja muito bem-vindo a mais uma entrevista da Fintrender. E hoje uma entrevista muito especial, com alguém que está muito envolvida em tudo que é blockchain aí no mundo corporativo, né? E que está dentro da iniciativa que o Banco Central do Brasil escolheu para fazer o real digital, né? A Hyperledger Besu é a plataforma que o Banco Central do Brasil escolheu para fazer o real digital. Hoje eu estou aqui com a Daniela Barbosa, que é General Manager de Blockchain and Identity na Linux Foundation e também Executive Director da Hyperledger. Tudo bom, Daniela?
Olá, bom dia. Está tudo bem. E você, como é que está?
Bom dia. Primeiramente, muito obrigado aí de você ter conseguido esse tempo aí da tua agenda que é conturbada. A gente estava falando um pouco antes, você está em Stanford agora, né? Que você já vai falar daqui a pouco, né? Então, assim, acho que muito obrigado por isso. E eu já entrando direto um pouco na conversa, eu vi que você tem uma experiência muito grande, tanto na parte de sales como na parte de technology, né? Então, assim, conta um pouquinho da tua trajetória que te levou a chegar na Linux Foundation.
Sim. Well, primeiro vou começar com a verdade que eu sou portuguesa. Eu nasci em Portugal, sou de Lisboa, e quando tinha 10 anos, os meus pais mudaram-se para os Estados Unidos. E vivemos aqui desde eu tive 10 anos. Ia todos os anos para trás para ver os meus avós. Pois eu falo português, por acaso falo português em casa, com os meus pais, os meus avós, os meus primos, os meus tios e tudo, mas vivo aqui nos Estados Unidos há mais de 40 anos. Eu falo português e hoje vamos falar inglês e em português também. E uma coisa que eu adoro eu estou aqui no Hyperledger Foundation há 7 anos e uma coisa que eu vejo é que toda a gente no Brasil e em Portugal e no mundo inteiro que fala português, há tanta gente na nossa comunidade nova que é portuguesa que eu vou ter a oportunidade de falar português ainda mais que falo agora. Por isso, muito obrigado por ter hoje aqui também.
Que ótimo, obrigado. É bom a gente falar isso, que daqui a pouco a gente muda para o inglês, né? A Daniela já está aí há mais tempo da vida dela falando inglês do que português, né? Então você acaba ficando bem mais confortável com o inglês. A gente faz inglês também, não tem problema nenhum. Depois eu vou colocar legenda em português para quem não entendeu inglês, mais tranquilo. Daniela, conta um pouquinho para a gente de como que é a Linux Foundation. Você entrou, ela é uma fundação, como é que é a parte de governança? Você entrou para fazer o quê? O que você está fazendo hoje? Como é que funciona isso?
So, eu vou dizer em inglês. O Linux Foundation...
We can move to English, no problem.
O Linux Foundation started 20 years ago, and it's really a home for some of the most important open source, open development projects around the world. Obviously, the most important of all being the Linux kernel, and the Linux kernel being one of the biggest open source communities in the world, as I mentioned before. But today, the Linux Foundation has hundreds of different open source projects, anything from automotive grade Linux, which is where the electrical operating system of cars resides, Academy Software Foundation, if you like to watch a lot of those Hollywood movies, the software that is made for those movies, many of those movies are built here at the Linux Foundation collaboratively and in the open. What that means is that organizations, companies, governments, individuals come together to work on core pieces of the technology. So the communities come together and they say, if we build together, we can build faster, we can use our pooled resources to be able to build software that then we can build our business on top of. This is very important in topics like cloud computing, for example, where cloud native computing is the Kubernetes project sits under the Linux Foundation, and majority of like everything you touch from a technology perspective, the phone that you're looking at now, the computers that you might be using, probably touches one, if not many, open source projects at the Linux Foundation.
Okay, that's great. And Hyperledger, I understand that's part of the Linux Foundation, right? But it's not really within the Linux Foundation. It's a kind of segregated initiative, right?
No, every project under the Linux Foundation has its own governance structure. So in 2015, 23 companies came together and decided that they wanted to build an enterprise blockchain consortium, right? There was companies that had code that they wanted to contribute. This included IBM with their contribution of what is now known as Fabric. This included Intel with their contribution of a project that is now known as Sawtooth, as well as a company called Seiremitsu in Japan, who contributed Iroha. So all those code contributions came in 2016 and 2017, early 2017. Because the community understood that blockchain was going to be important, and a lot of people didn't think blockchain was going to be important at the time, but the enterprises certainly did. And we had collaboration in financial services from some of the world's largest banks, healthcare companies, obviously large technology companies like Accenture and IBM, SAP, and others as well. And they knew that they wanted to build open source software collaboratively. And what that means is people come together, they bring their code, they bring their engineers, and they start basically building these projects. And very importantly, it's built under what we call open governance. So the Hyperledger Foundation today has a governing board, and this is made up of our premier members, and it has a technical oversight committee. And that technical oversight committee is voted upon by the developers in the ecosystem. So they vote who is going to be the governance, basically, of the project on a yearly basis. And this really leaves an important aspect of what we do here at the Linux Foundation, which is not just open source, right? Anyone could open source a piece of code, you could put it on GitHub, and you could say now everybody can see the code. But it's more importantly, open development and open governance. How do you make sure that anyone who shows up can have influence over the code, can participate, can contribute, from the simplest things of finding a bug and fixing the bug and contributing that, to making sure that from a project future that they have impact, right? That they have input into where the roadmap, for example, on these very important projects that are being used in the world's biggest supply chains, trade finance networks, central bank digital currencies, and digital identity infrastructures around the world. So how do you make sure that you do that? So the Hyperledger Foundation, when we started in 2016, was really focused on building these bringing together these companies and government organizations to collaboratively build what we call blockchain and blockchain-related technologies, which today, fast forward 7 years, the market is certainly very different and mature. And I think the foundation, the Hyperledger Foundation, has really made sure that we brought in the best of the projects that really address today's market needs.
Yeah, and coming back to the, let's say, to the foundations of the Hyperledger initiative, you said that IBM was the one of the first ones, right? They delivered the code for that. But Fabric, which was the name of the Hyperledger Fabric, the code that IBM just sent, was the most famous. Right? I think that it is the most famous blockchain, corporate blockchain initiative so far, right? Can you describe some of the projects that use this Hyperledger Fabric, and not maybe from two perspectives: the big ones, the ones that really made a big transformation, and the others that tried to do something but was not really prepared for some reason to use blockchain at that moment?
Yeah, so Hyperledger Fabric continues to be one of the most adopted permission distributed ledger frameworks. And just last year, an analyst company called Blockdata did a report where they interviewed the top 100 companies worldwide in market cap. So the biggest companies in the world, they interviewed 100 of them, and they asked, what blockchain projects do you have in your company, and 38% of them said that they had ongoing projects with Hyperledger Fabric. We also obviously had other Hyperledger projects show up on that list, including Hyperledger Besu, with many people called Ethereum, Enterprise Ethereum, but it's Hyperledger Besu. Back to Fabric. So Fabric is not only one of the top used continuously for permissioned blockchains, but also the most mature. So today, the Fabric community is actually working on V3, so version 3.0, which has a lot of important enhancements and enhancements that the market needs, right? Because it's been in the market for 7 years. It also has LTS releases. So if you know enterprise software, and I know that you do, right? If you know enterprise software, when enterprises, when big companies and small companies as well, or even governments are using code that become part of their infrastructure, right? That becomes part of their products or part of what they're delivering to their customers, or from a government perspective, from the citizens of the countries. They want to make sure that the code is very mature and that there is two things. One, things like LTS releases, long-term support releases, right? You know that you can revert back. The support of these releases in the community are going to be there. And that there's a commercial ecosystem, right? That there are vendors out there that you can partner with, and you don't have to just partner with one person, but that there's a healthy and very diverse ecosystem. So for example, in Brazil, there's a lot of companies that support Hyperledger Fabric, right? And they support it from the strategy, the architecture, like what are you going to build with blockchain, all the way up to the supporting of the projects once it goes into productions. So for example, we just welcomed a new member into the Hyperledger Foundation called GoLedger, and they have many implementations that they've deployed with Hyperledger Fabric. So for us at the foundation, it's really important, whether it's Fabric or Besu or Roja or Aries, any of our projects, that it has a healthy commercial ecosystem that any company can basically show up, or government, and say, hey, I'm interested in using this code base. I know it's supported by the community, and I can find assistance, or I can find support in the marketplace for it. And Fabric for sure is one of the top ones out there. The other thing is around training and certification. So if you look at Hyperledger Fabric, there is a strong training and certification program behind it. And at the Linux Foundation, we spend a lot of time and resources really focusing on that, making sure that if you want to hire an engineer that is an expert in one of our open source projects, that there's a path to get those engineering talents in. So Hyperledger Fabric has had a certification, and both for developers and administrators for the last 4 years. 4 years. We have a Hyperledger Certified Service Provider program, so you can see the companies that have been certified to provide Fabric services. And we also, we're just about to launch our new certification for Fabric as well. And we do that for multiple projects that we do. And that's really why we call it enterprise grade, and why a lot of people choose Fabric, because it is, it's scalable and it has the right support practices behind it.
Yeah. One thing that we were discussing was about some examples on the Hyperledger Fabric. We're going to go into that in a minute, but before that, to have a discussion on, let's imagine that I'm a possible client that wants to use the Hyperledger. So you have different products, right? As you said, the Besu, the Fabric, and how the client kind of decides that? Is it the client that just arrives to you say, oh, I want to use Hyperledger Fabric? Or there's an open discussion to say, oh, Besu is better for you than Fabric or on any other product that you have? How is the discussion handled?
So a couple of things. One is sometimes, especially enterprises, make a decision very specifically on the programming language that the DLT is. So for example, Besu is a Java-based client, right? And if you have developers and that's your choice, you might choose Besu because it's in Java, or Fabric is in Go. There are projects within our community that use Rust. So that's, at the base level. At the engineering level, that might be a decision point for a company to use. Next, if they're doing everything in-house, right, they'll do an evaluation of the different projects and the kind of things that are important to them from, a strategic perspective, whether it's about security, whether it's about scaling, right, the ability to scale out these networks. If it's important for them to have partners in the ecosystem, right, that they work with, who are the commercial providers that might be able to support their implementation, right? Do they already work with a system integrator that is already deploying a lot of Hyperledger Fabric or already deploying a lot of Hyperledger Besu? So there's a lot of different decision points as to when people choose one over the other. And just as I was talking about before, even the long-term support, right, of these systems, do I feel more comfortable building something that has, 2 versions of an LTS, of a long-term support system and a healthy ecosystem, or am I willing to do a little bit more support on a more innovative, newer project as well? So it really depends on the needs. For us at the foundation, we don't provide that service, right? We provide the education, the documentation, and then we point people to where they could go to find people to find companies to support their architecture, right? Their, the way that they're building out what they want to build out. And last, I always recommend people come to us, and I recommend look at use cases that are already out there, right? And if you're trying to build a similar use case, whether it's supply chain or trade finance or digital identity, take a look at that, look at the documentation that's available for the use cases, reach out to the community that has built using those use cases and have a conversation with them and say, hey, you chose to use, Hyperledger Indy to build this digital identity platform. Why is it? And should I do that as well? And our community is always very open to that.
Okay, great. Jumping now to the use case. So what's the best well-known use case for, let's say, Hyperledger Fabric?
Mm-hmm. I think it depends on which industry you are. I mean, one of the ones that is probably the longest, and I would say the one that a lot of people know, is the Walmart use case. This is called Food Trust. And Food Trust launched a good 5 years ago. And, the ROI that has been proven through Food Trust via Walmart and their supply chain partners, right? The supply chain companies that work with Walmart is really a use case that we point people to all the time. We have the case study on our website. It needs to be updated because they have a lot of great new updated return on investment numbers to do that. So, food supply chain and traceability has become more and more of a very important use case. Think of, for example, in Europe, the battery passport initiative and the regulation that just recently got approved by the European Union. There's a company called Circular that has been doing a lot of work specifically around minerals for the EV cars, the electronic vehicle car batteries. And the European Union has passed that legislation that basically requires track and trace for the minerals. And Circular, the company Circular, is really leading the way. And they have over 100 participants already on their platform, including some of the biggest manufacturers like Volvo. So I would recommend taking a look at some of the work that's being done there. But I think track and trace, which goes back to my, I think the most famous example, which is Food Trust, track and trace and sustainability tracking is going to continue being very important. And the majority of the use cases we see out there are built with Hyperledger Fabric in the marketplace.
Okay. Any good example on the financial market, Daniela, that you remember?
Of CBDC, central bank digital currencies. So if Hyperledger Fabric is being used in some of the ones that are already in production, including the Eastern Caribbean Bank, the ECB, with it's called Dcash. and which is a smaller CBDC, but one of the first actually out in the market. And once again, you learn a lot of lessons, and you learn to do things from doing some of these small pilots. Also, the Central Bank of Nigeria uses Hyperledger Fabric for their CBDCs, and although they've had some issues around the rollout and the adoption, it is not the technology. It hasn't been the technology. It really has been just how the region itself has approached the rollout of the central bank digital currency. But there are lots of other examples as well. I don't know if your audience is familiar with this, but the Atlantic Council CBDC tracker is an online resource, and you can basically get down to what technology people are using, and you'll see both Fabric and Besu, one of the top ones that are being used.
Yeah. And just jumping then to the CBDC discussion, so the one that I kind of it was not really a surprise for me, but the one thing that comes to the Brazilian market pretty well was the discussion on the central bank digital currency of Brazil, that the Real Digital, they decided to go for the pilot. They decided to use the Hyperledger Besu, right? So that's was essentially that's where I would say that most of the Brazilians that are on this market probably listen to the Hyperledger Besu for the first time. So you already said that Hyperledger Besu is kind of a Ethereum, kind of corporate Ethereum or something like that.
Enterprise Ethereum, yep.
Corporate Ethereum. So what's the difference in your view between, let's say, the Hyperledger Fabric and the Hyperledger and the Hyperledger Besu? So there's a difference in it's just the programming language. Why would the central bank decide to go for one or for another?
Well, like I said, I think the decision points are multi. Like, there's lots of reasons to decide over one over the other. If you think about Besu, and when I said it's, the market calls it Enterprise Ethereum, right? But Hyperledger Besu is very unique. So it came into the Hyperledger Foundation in 2019. And in 2019, it was called Pegasus. It was a contribution by a company called Consensus with the Y. And they brought it in because they, once again, wanted what I was talking about before, not just open sourcing the code base, but doing open development, right? Really building up a community that had multi-stakeholders, had multiple people participating. So Hyperledger Besu is an EVM. So it's an Ethereum virtual machine. It is also can be run as, you can run Hyperledger Besu as an execution client on the mainnet, as well as a permissioned EVM blockchain framework, okay? So you have optionalities, right? And very importantly, Hyperledger Besu will always have what I call parity to mainnet, right? So the benefits of things that are happening on the mainnet. So since the merge, right, the Ethereum mainnet has consensus clients and execution clients. Hyperledger Besu is an execution client. You could run it as an execution client to do that. And that's very important for the Ethereum mainnet, specifically for the client diversity, right? Being able to make sure that not just one client, which is Hyperledger Geth, which is the one that's the most used as an execution client. So we actually got a grant from the Ethereum Foundation last year in order for the for the mainnet developers, so Hyperledger Besu maintainers that are focused on mainnet, supporting them. So the Ethereum Foundation awarded Hyperledger Besu as a mainnet diversity client grant, which is really important because it gives us, you could see that the Ethereum Foundation is really focused on making sure that Besu is successful in the marketplace for that as well. So I think, and I don't know, I can't attest to one or the other of why the Banco Central do Brazil, why they made that decision. But what I see, especially a lot of financial services and banks, in making a decision specific to Besu, aside that it's Java-based and they're very interested in Java clients, it's also because that parity or that optionality and the closeness with the Ethereum mainnet.
Yeah, and there's a thing that you said just before that there's some words when you are deciding about the technology where you're going to have support on that. And in the case of Ethereum, you can leverage on the whole ecosystem that Ethereum has, right? As it's CVM compatible and it works more or less on the same path. So that helps on the decision as well, right?
Yeah, and there's things you could do. So two use cases that I want to point out for Hyperledger Besu that might be interesting for your audience. One is in Latin America with LaCChain. If you're familiar with LaCChain, part funded by the Inter-American Bank, Development Bank. And LaCChain is essentially creating a public permissioned blockchain infrastructure for the region, right? And what that means is that it is a public blockchain, right? But it has permissioned governance, because that's really important, right? If you're building a government infrastructure, and that uses Hyperledger Besu. I think they launched about 18 months ago, close to 24 months ago, and having a lot of successes in having local communities in Latin America and the Caribbean build use cases around digital identity, around supply chain, around financing on the LaCChain infrastructure, right? That once again is a permissioned public blockchain. In Europe, the European Blockchain Services is also built using Hyperledger Besu. So Europe, and they support Fabric and they support Besu as well. But Europe is just like LaCChain, building out this infrastructure that's a public permissioned blockchain to basically be able to build applications and use cases on top of EBSI, right? So I think it's really important. I think Besu allows that optionality a bit easier than many of the other enterprise blockchains out there.
Yeah. The question that always comes to my mind when I see a lot of, let's say, this is enterprise discussion, then is that why don't they really, what's the reason why they don't really go to the Ethereum directory, right? The public, non-permissional Ethereum blockchain. So in your view, what the difference here is just the let's say that you can have some control on the blockchain itself, or is it more about privacy or the other discussions?
So I think it's a combination of multiple things. Number one is regulation, right? And the fact that, if you are, a lot of these applications, there's not any clear regulatory, and this is my personal opinion, right? There's not any clear regulatory support worldwide, around the world, for using something like a mainnet, whether, a public blockchain, whether it's Bitcoin or Ethereum or, any of the others. So that's number one. And I do think that leveraging the EVM, the Ethereum virtual machine, leveraging all the fantastic engineering talent that's out there that are able to build the RC tokens and are able to build smart contracts and Solidity, right? That's really important for a lot of these use cases, because you want to make sure that you have a very well developed and growing engineering or developer ecosystem as well. So I think that having that, if you're going to build infrastructure, allowing for that optionality is good. And that's not saying that Hyperledger Fabric, for example, Hyperledger Fabric has supported the EVM for many years. There's actually a lab that just recently got introduced into the Hyperledger Labs, which is like our place for innovation where these kind of topics come in order to revive the Hyperledger Fabric EVM, because companies are asking, like, how can we support, we already have Fabric implementation, we want to support some of the EVM capabilities. So I think we'll get there. It's going to be a long time, and it's going to be, basically up to the community to drive the development of these things, but more importantly, obviously, the regulators worldwide to allow something like building government infrastructure on the Ethereum mainnet.
Okay, great, understood. So there's one other thing that you talked about now, which is interoperability, right? So that's one big word that's really amazing. So how do you see this interoperability between, let's say, the Hyperledger products, right? You said, okay, Fabric has some interoperability with EVM, but Besu is the one that's EVM, it's more EVM compatible. But how are the other Hyperledger products with related to interoperability between them?
Yeah, so we here at the Hyperledger Foundation understood early on that it wasn't going to be one blockchain to rule them all, right? We knew that there was going to be different approaches, but that essentially these are networks of networks, right? And that especially in the corporate enterprise space, companies need to participate in multiple networks, right? Let's say a supply chain and trade finance network. So how do you go about moving those assets from network to network and doing it to the core of the principles of blockchain, right? So that there's no double spending and all that. So early on in 2020, there was actually a lab that was started with Accenture and Fujitsu. And that lab then became a project, and it's called Hyperledger Cacti. Today, it's called Hyperledger Cacti. It has multiple contributions by Accenture. IBM also did a major contribution to Cacti last year with a lab that they had, which is called Weaver. And there are, just 2 weeks ago, R3 did a contribution specific to Corda called Harmonia, and it's currently in the labs as well. So R3, for those of you who don't know, R3 has a project called Corda that is also used in a lot of financial services use cases as well. And if you think about a lot of these networks, they say a fabric to Corda, right? A fabric to Corda network. Those connectors have actually been built and have been part of Hyperledger Cacti for a long time. So you can connect Fabric to Corda, or you can connect Fabric to Quorum, or you can connect Fabric to Besu, or you can do Besu to Corda. And these are all connectors that are basically built in the Hyperledger Cacti project. And think of it, it's like an SDK of SDKs for blockchains with all different approaches, and it's very modularized. So you can come in and you can build your own plugin to Cacti, right? If you want to build a Polygon to Fabric connector that then people can reuse. So interoperability is going to continue to be key. And we have, I think, some of the world's leading developers working in the Hyperledger Foundation, in the Hyperledger Cacti project, hands-on. Like these are companies like Accenture and Fujitsu and IBM and Huawei and others who are building these multi-networks globally for their enterprise customers, and they're all in the Cacti community building these connectors for these networks to interoperate.
Okay, great. Look now more for the future, Daniela. How do you see the development of DLT and blockchain for the future? With regards to true technology, that is a big discussion now on the Ethereum blockchain itself, which is zero knowledge and account abstraction. So how do you see these discussions within the enterprise blockchains?
Yeah, I think it's definitely, so if you think about privacy and the need for confidentiality in the majority, if not all, of enterprise blockchain implementations. And this is why it's always been an important aspect of projects like Fabric and Besu as well. So I do think, there's innovation that's happening. We actually have a meetup coming up here in San Francisco in 2 weeks' time, where we're going to have Visa come in and actually talk about some of the work that they're doing in this space. There's a lot of great projects here in Silicon Valley, at Stanford, also at Berkeley, addressing a lot of these requirements. And our CTO, our Hyperledger Foundation CTO, Hart Montgomery, has been involved in a lot of these projects. So we see there's interesting technology projects that I would love to welcome into the Hyperledger Foundation as future projects. We are recruiting and accepting new projects in this space. And I do think that, hopefully in the next year or so, you'll see some very interesting communities forming around, working on these, privacy first initiatives in both permissioned and public blockchains.
Okay,
so
great.
A preview on that.
Yeah, then that's great. Just one point that came to my mind. Now, when we're talking about these enterprise blockchains, there's you mentioned like the Corda one, the R3 one. So the main ones the way I see it's Hyperledger and Corda, right? They are the most they are used, at least in the financial market. That's my focus. So that's where we see most of the the projects in one or another of this thing. How do you see the competition in this environment going forward? So is it there's going to be a lot of others trying to do that, or it's going to be more a kind of 1, 2, or 3 like it is today?
Well, I think there's more than 1, 2, or 3. I mean, like even in the Hyperledger Foundation itself, we have multiple projects that very often compete, right? They compete with each other, for enterprises to make a selection of. Just on the competitive side, Hyperledger Foundation, we don't compete with anyone, right? Because we don't have projects and services that serve, right? So it is the companies that use the code that go to market and compete, and very much. Even within our own community, they compete for deals, right? There's been a lot of RFPs and RFIs, for example, right now happening in the CBDCs and the central bank digital currency spaces where the central banks are putting out RFPs and RFIs for work. And I know many of our Hyperledger members are competing for that work, and some of them coming in with very different proposals, right? And even project proposals, maybe some coming in with Besu and some coming in with Fabric, some coming in with Iroha. So like it really depends on, what that is. So I think there's space for it. I mean, if you think about anything like in the database world, right? There's multiple databases in approach, and there's constantly new innovation that's still happening in the database world. It wasn't like Oracle didn't win the database wars, many years ago, right? There's still innovation there. So I think that there's definitely plenty of space and opportunities for newcomers and new approaches to come in. And there's not going to be one blockchain, framework that's going to just rule them all. And for me, it's really important here at the Hyperledger Foundation that we find a home, and we call the foundation an umbrella, right? And it's an umbrella organization that there's places for competitive frameworks and tools to come in and have a place to openly develop their code under the same governance models, right? And I didn't mention this before, but very often things like central bank digital currencies or central banks or organizations like BIS or MAS, right? The Monetary Authority of Singapore, having them understand the governance of code and why that's important when they choose not just open source code, but that it's openly governed under something like the Hyperledger Foundation, I think is really important for them. So for me, our goal here at the foundation is to bring the best into our foundation, into our umbrella, and help them build a community and a commercial ecosystem around their code bases as well.
Okay, great. Now we are really close to the time that we have now. I know that you have another meeting in a couple of minutes there. Yeah. I just want to give you some moments now to deliver, let's say, a kind of final message, and where the people that want to engage with Hyperledger can find Hyperledger to talk about it.
Sim. Well, primeiro toda a gente pode vir para o Hyperledger Foundation. Nós somos abertos, open, everyone can participate. We have a mantra that says all are welcome. Todos aqui podem vir, não é? So para nós, go to hyperledger.org. Under hyperledger.org, você vai ver os case studies, os webinars, workshops, é tudo free. Everything we produce is free for anybody to use and participate in, and that is part of being an open source community. So go to hyperledger.org. If you want to learn how to participate in an open source community, click on participate. We have a regional chapter no Brasil. O nosso Hyperledger Foundation Regional Chapter do Brasil é sítio que pode vir falar com os outros que estão a construir usando o Hyperledger Technologies, e é graça e vocês podem todos participar. Also, join the community calls. If you're interested in Besu, they have community calls. You can join in, you can listen. If you're interested in Fabric, there's tons of content that is available on YouTube, and you can spend as much time or as little time as you want really understanding what the community has built. So all are welcome. Todos vêm e começa com o Hyperledger Foundation chapter no Brasil.
Tá ótimo. Daniela, muito obrigado. Parabéns aí pela tua trajetória, pelo sucesso que você tem, pelo que você está fazendo aí na Hyperledger na Linux, que tá muito legal isso para acompanhar, para a gente que está acompanhando e vendo esse movimento e falando com pessoa que nem você que está lá fazendo e vendo e atuando e transformando o mundo. Parabéns.
Sim.
Muito obrigado.
E nós temos de voltar, nós já temos tido no Brasil, tivemos um hackathon no Brasil há 3 ou 4 anos, mas vamos voltar para trás por causa que o trabalho e as pessoas, o pessoal aí no Brasil que está a fazer trabalho para o nosso Hyperledger community is amazing. So we'll be down there.
Great. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigado.
Obrigado. E para você que nos viu, isso aí, entrevista muito interessante com alguém que está lá fazendo no dia a dia e transformando o mundo, né? Então, assim, Hyperledger, tanto o Fabric, que é o mais famoso, quanto o Besu, que é o que está agora, compatível IVM, né? A Ethereum para a empresa, né? Que nem ela comentou, uma coisa muito legal e para a gente seguir acompanhando, aprendendo, tá bom? Não esquece de deixar o like, se inscrever no canal e compartilhar com aquele amigo e amigo que gosta desse assunto. E até semana que vem. Tchau, tchau.